Welcome to Tom's Messiaen vlog, episode 18. Now, last time I did a sort of précis of the Messe de Pentecote, introduced it in broad brushstrokes, which was a great thing to do and exciting to be able to do it at Blackburn Cathedral, where I happened to be at the time. Back here, I want to give a bit more detail on some of the component parts of the second movement. I sort of skated over the second movement a little bit in episode 17. It's the longest movement by far of the Messe de Pentecote, and there's a lot in there. And so I thought it would do it more justice if I brought it out and used it as a separate vlog post. Having said that, this isn't going to be some sort of exhaustive study of every single note of the thing. But like I say, I want to go into a little bit more detail. There are two aspects, or three aspects to that really. One is to consider to what extent the content of this piece reflects the text that inspires it. That's one thing. Another aspect is to examine just a little bit some of the musical components, because they happen to be, some of those musical components happen to be very typical Messiaen things to do, so it helps gain a little bit more of an understanding of how Messiaen's music works, why it sounds the way it does, and so on and so forth. And then the third thing is, having learned a couple of things, well, hopefully more than a couple of things, about what the piece consists of, you can then go and listen to it and listen to how all those ideas relate to one another. I'm not going to perform it here because it's not going to work on this organ, so you'll go and find a recording. Gillian Weir is obviously an option. Olivier Lattery is an option. Messiaen's own performance from La Trinité, well worth hearing, very much worth seeking out, and there are numerous other performances out there. But if you were to then go and listen to the piece, having learnt a few things about what's in it, you would then get a good sense of how typically Messiaen might structure a piece of music. Messiaen and form is possibly a topic for a whole vlog post in itself. But this particular piece, the second movement of the Messe de Pentecote, has this sort of collage-like sectional form, and that's very typical of Messiaen. There are lots of other things he does in terms of form and structure, but this is by no means an atypical piece, so great place to explore. Now, I spoke last time, before I move on to the nuts and bolts of this piece itself, I spoke last time about the place of the Messe de Pentecote in Messiaen's output, and how it grew out of his improvising at La Trinité, and how it also came to pass at a period of great experimentation during Messiaen's life. What I didn't do was give you any words from the man himself, so I'm going to do that now. I had a look at Messiaen's treatise, the Traité. It's enormous. This is something that was published after Messiaen died, something that he was writing and putting together over many years, and I'm gesticulating like this. It takes up about that much of your shelf, if not more. It's a vast collection of books, 7 volumes in total. You know, at least one of them's about that thick. But in there, amongst so many other things, is a discussion of the Messe de Pentecote. And I really want to quote a couple of things that Messiaen says, because I think they're great to hear. So firstly, his comment on his improvising at La Trinité and its importance to him. He said, oh, and I should add, by the way, that he's talking specifically here about the midday Mass on a Sunday, which was the Mass at which he was allowed to play modern music. In other words, improvise in a modern style. So that's the specific service he's talking about. Other services he did other things. But this is the midday Mass. So at the midday Mass on a Sunday, he'd, and I quote now, highlight the mysteries of the liturgical year, the grace proper to each mystery, the colour, the poetry, the feeling particular to each time and to each festival. And I think that question of evoking the feeling of something is absolutely key for me here. And as I said in episode 17, the way Messiaen captures the vivid, slightly unsettling weirdness and awe of Pentecost, the way he reflects that in the Messe de Pentecote, I think is really tremendous. So there we go. So there's Messiaen talking about the role of his improvising. Now then, about his improvisations, I'm going to quote a little bit more now. About his improvisations and their meaning and their context and their relationship to the Messe de Pentecote, Messiaen said this. about his improvisations. The terrifying growls of the beast of the apocalypse alternated there in his improvisations with the songs of thrushes and blackbirds, the noises of water and wind in the leaves with religious meditation and the storms of joy of the Holy Spirit. Hindu rhythms mingled there with the neumes of plain song. Moving on. There was the known and the unknown, the visible and the invisible, the world of men and the world of angels. This is how the Messe de Pentecote was born. Without being my best work, it is undoubtedly the most in keeping with my true nature. There's a statement. It was improvised several times during 1948 and 1949. I wrote it down in 1950. Then I gave up all improvisation. Well, that last bit is hyperbole. He didn't give up all improvisation, but that certainly was a full stop of that. In terms of the Messe de Pentecote is a full stop in terms of that particular period of Messiaen's life, and I think that's what he's trying to put across when he has, at that point, he stopped all improvisation. Because we know he didn't. I've got a CD of him improvising decades later at church. But anyway, moving on. Incidentally, Messiaen wasn't entirely unafraid of hyperbole. This is going off at a complete tangent, but I think you'll enjoy it. The Quartet for the End of Time famously received its first performance in a prisoner of war camp. And the musicians involved, Messiaen being one of them on the piano, were playing broken instruments. This much is true. But sometimes you'll read that the cello only had 3 strings, that Messiaen had said the cello only had 3 strings. And subsequent to that story doing the rounds, the cellist said, well, actually, there were 4 strings, there weren't 3 strings. And Messiaen admitted that he only made the 3-string comment. It was hyperbole. He'd said it, to make the point, and was rather amused that it had been taken absolutely literally and had sort of done the rounds as this story around the whole world. Oh my gosh, there are only 3 strings on the cello. How extraordinary. But it wasn't true, and Messiaen admitted as much. So I love that. But anyway, on to this movement. Now, Messe de Pentecote, rather in the manner of the Tournemire suites, this isn't a mass, an organ mass that has a Kyrie, a Gloria, a Sanctus and Agnus Dei, so on and so forth. What it has instead is 5 movements which cover moments of action in the mass. So the first movement is the entry of the priests, the last movement is the exit. There's a movement to be played during the distribution of communion, and so on and so forth. This movement, the second movement, is to be played during the offertory, when the offering is taken up. And the offertory happens just after the creed, when the congregation stand up and affirm their faith. And that's relevant because, in actual fact, rather than choosing a text which refers explicitly to the Holy Spirit, which of course the coming of the Holy Spirit is what Pentecost is all about, rather than doing that, what Messiaen does here is chooses a verse from the creed as the basis of this piece. So the first couple of verses of the Nicene Creed: we believe in one God, the Father, the Almighty, maker of heaven and earth, of all that is seen and unseen, or of all that is visible and invisible. And things visible and invisible is the little quote in italics that appears underneath the title of this piece. Things visible and invisible. And what did Messiaen have to say about that? What's the connection between that and the Holy Spirit? Well, Messiaen wrote that, amongst other things, the invisible is the realm of the Holy Spirit. So that's one connection. But he said more. He said, there's everything in those words, visible and invisible things. And he went on to talk about light and darkness, angels and men, sin and grace, the diameter of the universe and that of the proton, spiritual and material, drops of water, and the black grunts of the beast of the apocalypse. In short, Messiaen says, all that is clear and palpable, and all that is obscure, mysterious, supernatural, all that goes beyond science and reasoning, all that we cannot discover, all that we will never understand. And so Messiaen goes on. So there's a whole list of juxtapositions there, and that is what he's trying to reflect. Things invisible and things visible, darkness and light, and so on and so forth, are what Messiaen is seeking to evoke in this piece. So moving on to the structure of the thing. There are 3 main musical ideas, 3 big musical ideas, which I will describe in a second. And they appear at different points in the piece. And then there are other smaller linking passages that occur here and there. One of which is the grunt of the beast of the apocalypse, or the pit, things invisible, the darkness, unseen, however you want to look at it. And that's that bottom C on the 16-foot reed on the positive, which I talked about last time in episode 17. So that appears several times during the piece, and there are a couple of other ideas which just appear fleetingly here and there, like I say, as almost as sort of linking ideas. So they serve to mould the whole thing together. There's a coda at the end which offers some brief reminiscences of some of the stuff you've already heard. And then there's a final chord which Messiaen described as being like a question mark. The whole piece finishes in this sort of unresolved way. It's a wonderful chord, actually. Why don't I play it to you? I love it. So here's the final chord. To be played on an 8-foot flute, I've got one of them, but with the tremulant as well. I don't have one of them, and you shut the box progressively through the chord. So the piece finishes in this sort of unresolved and mysterious way. It's great. Anyway, so those are the sort of the small incidental details that wrap themselves around the big stuff. So let's get into these three big sort of blocks of ideas that you get. And the first thing I want to talk about is what happens right at the start of this piece, where Messiaen employs a technique he called personnage rythmique, rhythmic personalities. And he used an illustration from the stage to describe what he was going for here. He said, imagine three people on stage and one person is arguing at one of the others. So that person who's doing the argument, who's projecting their views and then projecting themselves onto the stage, they are, if you like, expanding to fill the space. The person on the receiving end of that is shrinking and getting smaller. And then the third person is standing there as an observer, staying the same, impassive perhaps, whilst this conversation takes place. So the way Messiaen reflects that in music is he takes three rhythmic cells, and you hear each one in turn, not necessarily always in the same order, I should say. You hear each one in turn, and one of them is always the same. One of them progressively lengthens, just by the addition of a single unit, perhaps just the addition of a semiquaver or whatever. So one of them gets longer, and the other one shortens. It's a technique you find quite a lot in several Messiaen pieces. There's a very famous example of a complicated example, I think, in the fifth movement of the Tarangulila Symphony, written around the same time that this was, of course. And Messiaen, by the way, does a similar thing. This is personnage rythmique, rhythmic personalities, but he does a similar thing with melody and I think harmony as well. So, what we have here is three Hindu rhythms. Messiaen was very taken by the charm of impossibilities, he says, of the Hindu rhythms, amongst others, present. They're not four square like Western classical music. Hindu music theory is a completely different thing. The rhythms sound unequal, even lopsided to our Western ears, and therefore intriguing to Messiaen. And this is all about upending our perception of time. Messiaen's music is so often concerned with time and that interaction between an eternal and omnipotent God's sense of time and the fact that he can act in his temporal world that he created. So there's, through the person of Jesus and through the Holy Spirit. So you've got that juxtaposition between the time that you and I experience and God's time and how they relate to each other. So that's the root of Messiaen's interest in time, in eternity. And his way of exploring that concept sometimes involves interesting rhythms. Also sometimes involves extremely slow music, as we know. But here it's interesting rhythms. So we have three Hindu rhythms, and the first one, Tritiya, I think, it's a semiquaver, and a dotted semiquaver, and Messiaen plays it on a 4-foot flute in the pedals, and it just goes. That's it. I'm not going to be able to reproduce the registration exactly here. There's 16 and 8-foot flutes on the manuals, and a resonance chord over the top of that little rhythmic figure. So something a little bit like this. Oh, I haven't got the coupler out. Try again. Not sure whether you can really hear that. But the chord's irrelevant in a way. The point is... And then there's another Hindu rhythm. That's that one. And that one progressively lengthens. Incidentally, there are chords over the top of that as well. So, that one progressively lengthens. So at this point in the piece, right at the start, it's 4 semiquavers, 4 semiquavers, 4 demi-semiquavers, sorry, 4 demi-semiquavers, and 2 demi-semiquavers. I can't even say demi-semiquaver, but you get the idea. 4/4/2, anyway. By the end of the piece, it's 9/9/7. It's got progressively longer. And then, played on the manuals on 16 foot and 2 foot with the box shut. So absolutely not something I can reproduce here at all. In terms of timbre, you have the third of these 3 Hindu rhythms. 14 demis, 10, 10, 6. That's the quantities at the beginning, if you like, the durations at the beginning. And it's the long notes which are of interest here. Messiaen puts semiquavers in the middle of the texture to keep things moving. But that sounds like this at the start of the piece. By the end of the piece, it's had a considerable number of demi-semiquavers shaved off it, so it sounds like this. So there are those 3 rhythmic cells, and as I say, one of them stays the same, the second one gets longer and longer every time you hear it, the third one gets progressively shorter. And the registration scheme itself, with dark resonance chords on a 16 and 8 foot manual registration, contrasting with this 16 and 2 foot with the box shut, with a bit more brightness to it, widely spaced chords, straight away you get that juxtaposition between light and dark, and there's that sense of mystery, and there's that playing around with time. So Messiaen works that process out. One of the values getting staying the same, one of them getting longer, one of them getting shorter, and he works that process out for the first sort of 2 or 3 minutes of the piece. And it comes back again at the end of the piece. So this personnage rythmique thing happens twice in this movement, once at the very opening and once towards the end. And I should say that the 3 rhythmic cells, you don't always hear them in order, so it's 1, 2, 3, then 1, 3, 2, then 2, 3, 1. He interverts them, like sort of change ringing or something like that. So there's big idea number 1, the opening music, and also, like I say, something that occurs just before the coda at the end of the piece. We then move on to big idea number 2, and this is a melody played on a really interesting and colourful registration, 16-foot quinton, 8-foot flute, and a TS. I don't have that here. This is why you need to go and listen to a recording. But the melody sounds like this. We move into one of our little linking passages. We're sort of cut off. I don't think I intended to play the whole thing when I started, but I do love it, so I played you the whole thing. So what about this melody? Well, it's quite sort of bright, and when it first occurs, you just the registration, the lightness of texture, because it's a monody. It's only it's a single line of music, so it's quite striking, and I think this plays into this idea of. That lightness is quite striking and plays into that idea of these juxtapositions that Messiaen's trying to explore in this piece. Of course, a monody, a line of music on its own, is something you find in Messiaen quite often. Les Chords Lauriers, for example, first movement. So anyway, there we go. That's big idea number number 2, and it happens 2 more times later in the piece, varied each time. So the second time you hear it, it's played on a broadly similar registration. There's a cornet in there as well, so it's a bit louder, and there's an accompaniment. And that is played on another manual and a single line, so you end up with a duet. And the substance of that accompaniment, Messiaen described as being derived from plainsong neumes. The sorts of gestures, the sorts of shapes in there are plainsong based, but there are also grace notes in there, which Messiaen attributed to Arabic melodic forms. And indeed, I should have said, the melody itself that I've just played to you, Messiaen also ascribed that to a sort of, or said that its inspiration came from Arabic melodic forms, although he doesn't expand on that, so I couldn't tell you anything more. He also likens the first line of that melody, by the way, to a melody you hear at the start of Ravel's Le Tombeau de Couperin. So here's the Ravel melody. And Messiaen's, of course, is... Messiaen draws the comparison. He doesn't say whether the Ravel melody inspired him directly or whether it's just a coincidence. He doesn't explain what his meaning is in even raising that. So who knows? It's certainly the case that Messiaen, however, like a lot of other people, such as Bach, I think it's a thing that geniuses do, Messiaen often would borrow, magpie-like, from different sources and sort of make other people's ideas his own. So perhaps that's what's happening here. Anyway, so the melody appears as a duo the second time you hear it, with the sort of Arabic / plain-songy accompaniment. And then the third time you hear it, it's played at half speed with this extraordinary registration. Go and listen to a recording to explore it, because I can't demonstrate it here. Melody played in long, slow notes, a 4-foot flute coupled to the pedal. Lovely chords in mode 3, transposition 1, in the left hand on the swell strings, and the right hand picks out the melody over the top of those pedal notes, but in short staccato semiquavers on a very bright registration of tierce and a 1-foot and so on and so forth. So it's a very distinctive texture, very distinctively Messiaen-like organ texture. And in between each phrase of the melody that third time, there are songs of blackbirds and robins. So there we go. So idea 1 is personnage rythmique, which I've shown you already. Idea 2 is that wonderful monody, which I've just shown you. That occurs 3 times, each time slightly differently. And then the third and final big idea is this series of interversions of chromatic durations. What the heck am I talking about? Okay, so chromatic durations. Take 1 unit of duration, a semiquaver. Then your next note is 2 semiquavers, and your next note is 3, 4, 5, so on and so forth. Those are chromatic durations. And Messiaen takes 5, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, and then interverts them. So the right hand plays a series of chords. The first one is 1 semiquaver long, the next one is 2, the next one is 3, the next one is 4, the next one is 5. It starts the process again, and this time it's 1, 2, 3, 5, 4, then it's 1, 2, 4, 5, 3, then it's 1, 2, 4, 3, 5. You get the idea. Again, it's this sort of interversion, a bit like change ringing. So the right hand does that. The left hand does something very similar, but it's 5, 4, 1, 2, 3. I've got it written down. 5, 4, 1, 3, 2. 5, 4, 2, 1, 3. This isn't all just in my head. It's on a piece of paper on the organ bench. I could have really fooled you there. You could have thought I'd memorised all that sort of stuff. Anyway, the left hand does that. You get the idea. In a different mode. So the right hand plays in mode 3, transposition 1. The left hand plays... So the right hand is in 3, 1. The left hand is in mode 4, transposition 1. And the pedal does something similar rhythmically to the other 2. Again, 5 chromatic durations interverted, but differently to the other 2 parts, and that's in mode 2, 1, transposition 1. So these things are kind of cutting across each other, and it's a very dense and dark texture, especially given the registration, which is a sort of oboe and a 16-foot on the swell, and a sort of 16/8/4 registration on the for the right hand, this dark swell sound is for the left hand, I should have said, and then pedals also with very heavy registration. So it's a very dark and complex world, and I can't possibly do it justice here, but I'll give it a go. Bar wrong. Not really thinking about. I didn't really intend to play the whole thing to you, but there we go. So there's that one, and that idea. It's in context. It's a very dark and obscure sound, like I say, because of the registration. So again, we get this light and dark contrast thing going on. And that musical process has gone through 4 times, separated by grunts of the Beast of the Apocalypse, amongst other things. The first 2 times it happens, it sounds much as I've just played there. And the third and fourth times, the left hand and pedal carry on doing a similar thing to what they were doing before, same process, but over the top, the right hand plays staccato semiquaver chords. You get the idea. So those are the 3 big building blocks. Personnage rythmique at the beginning and towards the end. That monody heard alone immediately after the personnage rythmique at the start, and then occurs 2 other times, once as a duo, once in half time, with birds singing in between each phrase. And then the interversions of chromatic durations, that dark stuff that happens 4 times and in some ways sort of feels like the heart of the piece. And it's by going through those 3 processes, by placing them where he does in the structure, and linking them with the grunts of the Beast of the Apocalypse on that 16-foot reed and 1 or 2 other sounds, and having those birds singing towards the end and that mysterious chord, it's by placing all those things together carefully that Messiaen produces his painting, really, to evoke a sense of things visible and invisible, and the invisible being the realm of the Holy Spirit. So mystery and, like I say, a sort of vivid awe and weirdness, I think, is Pentecote in a nutshell, isn't it? So, like I say, this piece does it so well. So I hope that's been helpful. I hope that has, at some length, I have to say, probably the longest vlog post ever, given you a sense of how this piece works, given you a sense of some of Messiaen's musical techniques, personnage rythmique, interversions, all these things crop up throughout Messiaen's output in different places and in different ways. So we've heard a little bit in detail about some nuts and bolts of Messiaen's writing, and if you now go and listen to the piece from end to end, hopefully it'll make more sense to you if it didn't make sense before, and if you knew the piece well, then perhaps I hope that I've brought something new to you nonetheless. So that's it. I'll see you again for episode 19.